The grand city of Thebes buzzed with excitement. It was the day of Princess Isetnofret's royal wedding to Prince Amenemhat, a union that the entire kingdom had been waiting for. The streets were lined with crowds, their faces bright with joy as they cheered for the couple who were destined to rule Egypt together. The palace was adorned with the finest flowers, and the scent of incense hung in the air. The princess, radiant in her golden gown, walked down the aisle, her heart swelling with happiness. She had dreamt of this day for years of becoming queen, standing by the side of her beloved prince. The future of Egypt seemed as bright as the sun itself, filled with promises of glory and peace. But even in the midst of the celebrations, there was a sense that something unseen lingered in the shadows. No one could have foreseen the storm that would soon darken this moment. As the ceremony continued, an old seer, whose name was whispered only in fear, stood among the guests. She gazed upon the couple with piercing eyes and murmured an ancient profession that would haunt the princess forever. "The bride who wears the crown will soon be cast into the dust," she spoke in a voice that sent a chill through the air. Guests turned to each other in confusion, dismissing her words as the ramblings of an old woman. The young princess, her face radiant with the light of the wedding, brushed aside the warning. Her joy drowned out the echo of the prophecy. But deep within, a tiny seed of unease took root, though no one, not even Isetnofret herself, could understand the depth of its meaning. It would be a mistake she would soon regret. The celebrations that followed were a grand spectacle. Music filled the halls. Dancers twirled in their elaborate costumes, and laughter echoed through the royal palace. Isetnofret and Amenemhat danced together as one, their love and ambition intertwined. She felt as though nothing could break the bond between them. Nothing could stop their dreams of ruling Egypt. The weight of the future seemed light upon her shoulders. She had everything: beauty, love, and a future bright with power. The people adored her, and her marriage to Amenemhat was seen as the perfect union of strength and wisdom. Little did she know, the very power she sought would be the one thing to betray her. In the midst of the revelry, a figure moved through the crowd, unnoticed. A man cloaked in dark robes, his face concealed in shadow. He watched with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the joy of the event. As he passed by, he whispered something to a trusted servant who nodded and hurried off. The air seemed to grow colder as the mysterious man's gaze lingered on the princess. There was something unsettling about him, something that made even the most seasoned courtiers feel uneasy. He was not an invited guest, and yet his presence could not be ignored. His quiet but ominous actions would soon send ripples through the palace, forever altering the course of Isetnofret's life. The wedding that had begun with such promise was about to become the catalyst for her tragic fall. Princess Isetnofret had never known a love like the one she shared with Prince Amenemhat. Their first meeting, under the canopy of stars on a warm evening, felt like destiny itself had crafted it. He was a man of strength and wisdom, admired by all of Egypt. She was a radiant beauty, destined for greatness. Their union had been foreseen long before their first glance. He was everything she had ever dreamed of in a husband. His eyes shone with intelligence, and his smile made her feel as though the entire world revolved around her. When he spoke, it was with conviction. And when they were together, time seemed to stand still. Their love was the kind that could bind an empire. Each letter exchanged during their courtship, each whispered word of affection, wove them closer together. Isetnofret believed they were unstoppable, bound by both love and fate. Their marriage would be the beginning of something legendary, a reign that would echo through the ages. Little did she know, The dreams they shared would soon shatter, and love would become something far darker. The day of their wedding arrived with great fanfare, unmatched by any other celebration in the kingdom. The streets were lined with golden banners, and the air was thick with the sound of joyful music. The people gathered, their hearts alight with hope, for the union of Isetnofret and Amenemhat signaled a new era of prosperity. The royal palace was transformed into a haven of elegance, with marble floors and walls adorned with delicate tapestries. Isetnofret, dressed in shimmering gold and white, was a vision of grace as she walked down the aisle, her heart pounding with anticipation. Prince Amenemhat, standing tall and proud, awaited her at the altar, his eyes locked onto hers with a fierce intensity. As they exchanged vows, the crowd cheered, and the palace echoed with the sound of their future triumphs. It was a perfect day, full of promise. Yet in the deepest corners of the palace, the whispers of jealousy and envy began to stir, unnoticed by the bride and groom. Beneath the gilded glamour of the ceremony, unseen forces were already at work, plotting a future that would tear their world apart. As she stood beside her husband, the weight of the crown felt lighter than she had imagined. Isetnofret believed that together with Amenemhat, she would shape the future of Egypt, bringing about a reign of unmatched peace and prosperity. As the queen, she would be revered not just as a ruler, but as a woman of wisdom, grace, and unparalleled power. She dreamed of monuments in her name, of statues that would immortalize her legacy for generations. But her vision went beyond mere luxury. She wanted to guide the people, ensure their happiness, and make Egypt a land of eternal glory. She saw herself as both a wife and a sovereign, a queen who would stand shoulder to shoulder with her husband, equally adored by the people. She believed her marriage to Amenemhat was the beginning of a dynasty that would stretch across millennia. In her mind, the throne was not just a place of authority, but a symbol of their shared purpose. Her ambitions burned bright and fierce, as she was determined to be remembered not just as a queen, but as a ruler of Egypt in her own right. But the deeper she sought to entwine herself with the power of the throne, the more she unknowingly set herself on a path where betrayal and tragedy would soon find her. Life in the palace was as grand as Isetnofret had imagined, though it was not without its challenges. The initial months of her reign were filled with the excitement of learning the intricacies of governance, meeting with advisors, overseeing the construction of new temples, and welcoming dignitaries from all over the world. She and Amenemhat ruled side by side, though it was clear that much of the power in the palace lay in the hands of the old counselors and nobles who had their own interests to protect. Isetnofret worked tirelessly to prove herself, making decisions that pleased the people and trying to establish a fair rule. However, the more she tried to exert influence, the more she realized how deep the currents of palace politics ran. Power was not simply a matter of will, it was also about manipulation and loyalty. Two things Isetnofret was still learning to navigate. Behind the facade of friendship and loyalty, rivalries simmered, and whispers of dissent were never far. The courtiers, ever watchful, tested her every move, eager to see if she truly had the strength to rule. Despite the challenges, Isetnofret believed in her heart that she was on the right path, that her rise to power would be unstoppable. But the palace was not what it seemed, and the dangers it held were just beginning to make themselves known. The grandeur of the palace soon grew less enchanting as an unsettling new presence arrived. A foreign dignitary, dressed in a cloak of midnight blue, arrived at the palace under the guise of a visiting ambassador. His name, Nabu, was spoken quietly by the servants, his reputation unknown to all but a few. Tall and slender with striking, sharp features, Nabu had an air of mystery surrounding him. He claimed to come from a distant land across the desert, a kingdom whose name even the scholars in Egypt scarcely knew. Isetnofret welcomed him as she would any royal guest, but something about him unsettled her. Nabu's eyes, dark as the night sky, seemed to look right through her, as if he saw more than the royal facade she presented to the world. His smooth, almost hypnotic voice held an unsettling calmness as he spoke of ancient customs, strange rituals, and distant legends that seemed to hold little connection to Egypt's grandeur. He often lingered near the court's most influential nobles, whispering into their ears. And Isetnofret soon learned that some of them were listening with an unusual intensity. No one seemed to know much about Nabu's past, and his cryptic conversations were beginning to cause unease among the court. Isetnofret, always careful and aware of the palace's politics, felt a strange pull toward him, an instinct she could not explain. But what she didn't realize was that Nabu wasn't simply a visitor. He was an agent of change, sent with a purpose that would soon unravel everything she had built. As weeks passed, the atmosphere in the palace began to shift. Whispers echoed through the corridors, fueled by jealousy and suspicion. The courtiers, once eager to serve their queen, began to show signs of resentment. Isetnofret's rise to power had not gone unnoticed, and her increasing influence in the palace had begun to draw the attention of those who had once been content with their roles in the shadow of her marriage to Amenemhat. Some nobles began to question her authority, mocking her youthful ambition. In hushed voices, they spoke of her in terms that undermined her legitimacy, suggesting that a woman, no matter how skilled or intelligent, was never meant to rule Egypt alongside her husband. Among these courtiers, Isetnofret's closest confidant, Lord Menkae, a wise and revered member of the council, began to distance himself. At first, his withdrawal was subtle delays in meetings, missing counsel, but soon it became clear that he was no longer the ally she once thought him to be. Isetnofret could feel the walls of her power beginning to close in. The nobles who had once celebrated her success now circled her like vultures, eager to discredit her. Some suggested that Amenemhat, weak in health and absent for long periods, would never be fit to rule. Rumors of her becoming a regent instead of a queen grew louder by the day. As Isetnofret began to hear these whispers, she could not ignore the gnawing sensation that something was terribly wrong in the palace. But she was too deep in the web of courtly politics to see the full extent of the betrayal. What she didn't know was that this growing discontent was not only within her court, it was being stoked by the mysterious Nabu, whose secret influence was already at work. One morning, the palace awoke to the shocking news that Pharaoh Amenemhat had fallen gravely ill. His body, once the picture of strength, had been struck by a sudden fever that rendered him weak and immobile. He had gone hunting, as was his custom, but when he returned from the desert, he was nothing like the man Isetnofret had married. The pharaoh's absence was like a great dark cloud over the palace. As the days passed, his condition worsened, and Isetnofret found herself forced into a role she never imagined. Without her husband's guidance, she had to make decisions she had never been prepared for. The weight of the crown now seemed unbearable. Ministers and advisors swarmed around her, offering suggestions and demands. Though her people loved her, Isetnofret felt the burden of every choice she made. She struggled to maintain control, but with the pharaoh's absence, a power vacuum began to grow. Her enemies, once subtle in their manipulations, began to show their true intentions. They saw her as vulnerable, an untested queen who lacked the strength to rule alone. To the outside world, Isetnofret continued to stand strong, her resolve unbroken, But deep within the palace walls, tensions were rising, and the courtiers' whispers had now turned into open disdain. Nabu's influence was spreading like a poison. His presence grew more frequent in the court, as he whispered in the ears of those who were once loyal to Isetnofret, pushing them toward rebellion. The throne, now teetering on the brink of chaos, seemed to be slipping out of her grasp. As Pharaoh Amenemhat's illness dragged on, the power dynamics in the palace began to shift more dramatically. Isetnofret had no choice but to take control, making decisions that affected the kingdom and its future. However, what she didn't realize was that her actions were being manipulated by unseen forces. Every step she took to strengthen her reign seemed to push her further into a trap. The court, once her domain, had been quietly taken over by those who worked against her nobles, priests, and advisors, who used her vulnerability to their advantage. Even her closest allies, like Lord Menki, began to speak out against her, claiming she was not fit to rule without her husband at her side. These whispers reached the ears of the people, and slowly, doubt began to creep into the minds of even the most loyal servants. Isetnofret's attempts to strengthen her position had inadvertently driven a wedge between her and the very people who had once supported her. But it wasn't until Nabu's influence truly took root that she realized the full extent of the betrayal. As Nabu continued to weave his web of lies, he sowed seeds of doubt in Amenemhat's health, claiming that the pharaoh's illness was not natural but a result of an ancient curse tied to Isetnofret's bloodline. This insidious rumor spread throughout the palace like wildfire, and Isetnofret found herself battling a growing tide of suspicion. The more she tried to assert herself, the more she seemed to lose ground. Her world, once filled with hope and dreams of power, was crumbling. But the most dangerous seeds of betrayal had yet to sprout, and soon, the very palace she had once ruled would become her prison. It began with small, subtle changes. Isetnofret's orders, once executed without question, were now ignored or delayed. Servants who had once been her loyal attendants began to avoid her gaze, their eyes darting away when she passed by. Trusted officials began to offer their advice less frequently, and soon, even her closest friends began to withdraw. Isetnofret, ever vigilant, noticed the changes, but she could not understand why it was happening. One evening, she summoned the head of her royal guard to discuss a matter of security, only to find that he had disappeared without a trace. Her trusted maid, who had served her since childhood, was also missing. Even more troubling, Nabu seemed to be everywhere, his presence at her side in court, speaking on behalf of the royal family, and mingling with her enemies seemed too coincidental. He no longer hid his true intentions. He was no longer just a diplomat or ambassador. He was pulling the strings in the palace, and Isetnofret, once the queen of the court, was becoming an invisible figure in her own domain. The signs were clear. Nowhere imprisonment had begun. The walls of her own palace were closing in, and she was trapped in a web of lies, betrayal, and manipulation. It happened without warning. Isetnofret had spent days poring over the kingdom's affairs, balancing her royal duties with the rising whispers of discontent. But one evening, as she was preparing for a private council meeting, the doors to her chambers burst open. Guards once loyal to her now stood at attention, their eyes cold and devoid of the warmth they had once shown. They seized her with brutal force, and before she could even comprehend what was happening, a harsh voice echoed through the halls. "By the decree of Pharaoh Amenemhat, you are under arrest for treason." Isetnofret's heart raced as her world crumbled around her. "Treason? What is this madness?" she demanded. but her voice faltered as the room seemed to spin. The guards did not answer. They bound her wrists, dragging her toward the throne room, where her fate was already being decided. In the depths of her mind, she had suspected something was wrong, but to be accused of treason by her own husband, the very Pharaoh she had sworn to stand beside, was unthinkable. Yet the courtroom was cold, filled with officials who once spoke her praises, now silent as stone. Her eyes searched for Amenemhat, but he was nowhere to be found. And then, in a moment that would forever alter her life, Lord Menki, her once loyal advisor, stepped forward, reading aloud the charges against her, charges she had never imagined. A conspiracy to overthrow the Pharaoh. "You are a danger to the throne," he declared, his voice unwavering. The weight of the words shattered Isetnofret's heart. It was clear now. She had been betrayed, not just by the court, but by her own husband. Her royal status was stripped away in an instant, and the woman who had once been adored by the people was now nothing more than a prisoner. The grand robes she wore for court were torn from her, replaced with the tattered rags of a common servant. The cold stone of the dungeon was where she would be held, not the iron chambers of the queen. As she was thrust into the cell, Isetnofret could feel her dignity slipping away with every harsh shove. The guards, who once obeyed her every command, now turned their backs and mocked her as they locked the cell door behind her. Tears of rage and confusion burned in her eyes, but she swallowed them down. The humiliation was far worse than the physical chains that bound her. The betrayal of those she trusted, her closest allies, her husband, her kingdom, was a blow she could not recover from. Outside the stone walls, the people celebrated, believing that their queen had finally fallen from grace. They rejoiced, ignorant of the truth, while Isetnofret, stripped of her title and power, was left to languish in the darkness. In the silence of her confinement, she was forced to confront the truth. She was not just imprisoned in a cell, but in the very palace she had once ruled. It was not until days later that Nebu finally revealed his true nature. He appeared in the dungeon, standing tall and confident, his dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "So, the mighty queen has fallen," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Isetnofret's pulse quickened as she recognized him not as a diplomat, but as the orchestrator of her downfall. The calm and charismatic foreigner had been playing his part all along, weaving a web of lies and deceit. He smiled darkly, enjoying the sight of her despair. "You were never meant to rule, Isetnofret. The gods did not choose you," he continued, his words cutting deep. "Your bloodline is tainted, your destiny unworthy of the throne." The revelation hit her like a wave crashing against rocks. Nabu was no mere ambassador. He was a member of an ancient faction that believed the bloodline of pharaohs was cursed, and that only a pure line, untouched by the sins of the past, could rule Egypt. He had been working from the shadows, manipulating the court and twisting the truth, convincing Amenemhat's closest advisors that Isetnofret's reign was an abomination. His influence had poisoned the very palace she had ruled with love and hope. The betrayal was complete. Nabu, the man who had seemed so trustworthy, had been the architect of her ruin. And now, with the pharaoh's illness and her imprisonment, he had successfully replaced her with a puppet ruler who would serve his own dark purposes. "Your fall was inevitable," Nabu said with finality, turning to leave her in her cage. "The throne was never yours to claim." The door slammed shut, and for the first time since her capture, Isetnofret felt true despair. She had been a pawn in a game far larger than she could have ever imagined. Days turned into weeks. as Isetnofret languished in the dungeon. But the final act of betrayal was yet to come. A grand spectacle was planned at her public execution. The court had decided that the best way to rid themselves of the unfit queen was to make an example of her, to send a message to anyone who dared oppose the new order. Isetnofret was dragged from her cell, her once proud form now gaunt and weak. The entire city gathered in the courtyard as she was brought to the stage, shackled and humiliated. The crowd was silent as they watched their fallen queen stand before them, her eyes filled with defiance. She refused to cry, to show weakness. She would face her end with dignity, even if it meant the end of everything she had once fought for. But as the blade was raised, ready to strike, something unexpected happened. In that instant, a great commotion erupted in the crowd. An uprising, led by those who still remembered her greatness, swept through the palace gates. Isetnofret's loyal servants, those who had not betrayed her, broke through the guards and rushed to free her. Chaos erupted, and in the confusion, the execution was stopped. But Isetnofret's fate was far from secure. As she was whisked away in the chaos, she knew that the danger was far from over. She had narrowly escaped death, but she was now a fugitive in her own kingdom, her position shattered beyond repair. Isetnofret had been given a second chance at life, but it came at an unimaginable cost. Once a queen, adored and respected, she's now a shadow of her former self. The grand halls she had once walked with grace now seemed foreign to her, a place where only whispers filled the air. Stripped of her royal status, Isetnofret was reduced to a common servant, forced to live in the very palace that had once been hers. Her once beautiful chambers were now occupied by others, and the servants who had once bowed to her now treated her with disdain, avoiding her gaze whenever she passed by. Every step she took in the palace was a reminder of what she had lost: her dignity, her title, her power. Yet, there was still a fire inside her, a quiet anger that burned through the veil of humiliation. She had been broken, yes, but not defeated. As she worked in silence, cleaning the very floors she had once ruled from, Isetnofret's mind never ceased its plotting. She would never forget the faces of those who had betrayed her: Amenemhat, who had turned his back on her, and Nabu, the architect of her downfall. They had stripped her of her crown, but they had not taken her spirit. In the depths of the palace, far from the gaze of her enemies, Isetnofret began to gather her strength once more. She would rise again, but she knew it would not be in the way the courtiers expected. Though Isetnofret had been reduced to a mere servant, her mind was still sharp, and she quickly realized that in her new position, she could gather the very information she would need to regain her power. She began to listen carefully to the servants who passed through the halls, overhearing their conversations about the palace and the court. She learned of Nabu's growing influence, his control over the Pharaoh, and how he had begun to manipulate the royal advisors to serve his own dark purposes. But she also learned of the discontent among the lower ranks. There were still those who remembered the queen she had been, who believed she had been unjustly cast aside. Slowly, carefully, Isetnofret began to plant seeds of loyalty among the servants who had once been loyal to her. In secret, she whispered of her plans to those who would listen, promising them that the day would come when she would take back what was rightfully hers. She learned of the Pharaoh's worsening health, of the political instability that followed his condition. The court was divided. Some believed Amenemhat was dying, while others believed he had been poisoned. Isetnofret could feel the winds of change stirring. With every secret she uncovered, every loyal servant she gathered, her plans took shape. She would no longer be a prisoner in her own palace. She would be the one to decide her fate. Though she appeared to be nothing more than a humble servant, Isetnofret never lost her connection to the power that flowed through the veins of her bloodline. As she moved through the palace, unnoticed and unseen, she began to gather knowledge not just about the palace's politics, but about the secret alliances, the betrayals that had been quietly taking place around her. She learned that Amenemhat's health had been deteriorating for some time, and Nabu's influence had been quietly pushing for his eventual replacement. But what Nabu did not know was that the people were beginning to see through his machinations. Whispers of rebellion grew louder as Isetnofret's loyalists started to speak out in the shadows, rallying against Nabu and his supporters. The palace, once a fortress of deception, was beginning to show cracks, and in those cracks, Isetnofret saw an opportunity. The palace guards, once under the sway of Nabu, were slowly realizing that they had been manipulated into betraying their true queen. It would take time, but with every ally she gained, her plan grew more certain. Isetnofret would not be the servant for long. As the days passed, she quietly prepared for the moment when she would take back the throne, using all the knowledge she had gained from her time in the shadow. The palace might have stripped her of her power, but it had not taken away her ability to command the hearts of those who still remembered her as their queen. The tables would soon turn, and when they did, Nabu's influence would crumble. Isetnofret's moment of redemption came when she least expected it. The pharaoh's health had worsened, and rumors of his death had begun to spread through the palace like wildfire. Nabu, ever the opportunist, had begun to make his move, positioning himself to take control of Egypt. He thought he had believed that Isetnofret was broken beyond repair, a mere shadow of the woman she had once been. But he had underestimated her. The day came when Nabu called for a grand assembly in the throne room, a final declaration of his dominance over the court. The nobles, eager to align themselves with the new power, filled the room, awaiting Nabu's triumphant rise to the throne. But when the doors opened, it was not Nabu who entered, but Isetnofret. The courtiers turned in shock, their faces pale with disbelief. She stood tall, regal even in the tattered dress of a servant. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow, now burned with determination. "The throne was never yours to take," she said, her voice strong and clear. The room fell silent as Isetnofret walked to the front of the hall, her presence commanding the attention of every soul in the room. With a single motion, she gestured to the pharaoh's weakened form, now barely able to stand. "You've played your games, Nabu, but Egypt will never bow to a traitor," she declared. The guards who had once been loyal to Nabu now turned to Isetnofret, recognizing the true ruler in her. With her loyalists at her side, she seized the moment. Nabu, realizing his fate had been sealed, attempted to flee, but he was captured before he could escape the palace. The false ruler was brought to justice, his plans shattered, and the people who had once doubted Isetnofret's strength now celebrated her return to power. With Nabu gone, Isetnofret reclaimed her rightful place beside Amenemhat, who, though gravely ill, understood that his time had passed. Together, they would restore Egypt to its former glory. But Isetnofret would never forget the lessons of her fall. Her power, now unchallenged, would be used wisely, not just for the people of Egypt, but for herself. Her reign would be one of strength, resilience, and the quiet knowledge that no betrayal could break the spirit of a true ruler.